All right. Good evening, everybody. Looking forward to giving folks a chance to jump in. I know you guys have had a chance to jump in and participate in this great conversation. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with a great person, near and dear friend to me, and a great friend and advocate to the state of Maryland, the city of Baltimore, and just everything that this great man represents to this region. None other than Baltimore City Councilman and City Council President Nick Mosby. Nick Mosby, how you doing, brother? How are you feeling?
I'm doing good. How you doing, Brother Dees?
Good, good. Now I want to preface this ahead of time, so there's no there's no misunderstanding. Nick Mosby is a great friend of mine. I've known him for over 20 years. It's amazing when I just said that, as we both
That
are.
means that means we old, man. That's all.
that means that
We can't
means
say nothing else.
that means. And when I said it, I was like, "Is that right?"
Yeah, that means we got some gray, some lost hair, some extra pounds. That's all that means right there. That's
All of
20
that, you
years.
got to clean the head, man. Make sure the grays don't show, you know. But we both were students at Tuskegee University, and
I
great.
see you with Booker T over your shoulder, man. I like that, man.
He's in the back. That's right. That's right, man. And on the yard together in the great state of Alabama, and just beautiful years at a great institution. But it's just a blessing to be able to now, 20 years into the future, 20 plus years into the future, to be able to be here together and
Who
in a
who
city
would
that we both.
who would have thought that, Byron Dees, 20 years ago, meeting you and meeting me in the Commons, that we would be sitting here in these roles and these capacities talking to each other?
Well, here's the piece. I knew you would be here. That I knew you would be.
Did you? All right.
It was clear. It was clear 20 plus years ago that you were coming back doing exactly what you are doing right now 20 plus years ago. Myself, on the other hand, I had never been to Baltimore. So the fact that my first job out of college was here in private banking for SunTrust Bank, that was, blew me away. But the fact that that we're here and we're able to kind of, I fell in love with the city. And I probably should lead with that truthfully. I'd never been to Baltimore. Born and raised Sanford, Florida. And when I got to my first job here in Baltimore, I was with SunTrust Bank, and I just fell in love. Fell in love with the city, the access to everything, access to all the major metropolitan cities. I felt like this was a great region to build something, to build a business, to build a family. And so to be able to, it wasn't long after that, maybe about a couple of years after that, I realized that you were really hands-on on inside and came back to your home and went to work in the community. And it was great, gave me a great opportunity to participate, to see it from someone who was born here, who had a deep connection here in the city. And I'm more than thankful for that experience over the past decade or so in working in the city and just going to work. And so, which really leads us to this conversation. And for those of you who don't know me and don't know our group, the Dream Makers Network, we are a professional networking group here in the city of Baltimore and have actual networks throughout the country. And we focus on personal development, economic activism, and charitable giving. And this conversation really encompasses really all of that as we begin to take a deeper dive into the economics of the citizens of this city and how we can really outline and discuss generational wealth in a way that public policy can play a role. And so as I learned a little bit more about the Dollar House legislation, it really gave me an opportunity to think about this from a larger scale, and especially knowing that some of the viewers who will participate in this are from other cities and thinking about some of the same type things as it relates to housing in urban America. Wanted to, have a conversation with you, someone who is really a thought leader, policy advocate, legislator, and someone who's been on the ground to kind of really unpack this in some detail. And then let's unpack really the actual legislation. But let's do that. We'll take a second. I wanted to really talk about this from a why perspective. Why this particular legislation, and even from your perspective, why does Dollar House legislation matter to the city of Baltimore?
Well, there's a couple reasons why. One, we all know the importance. Well, first, I'm gonna go all the way back. I'm gonna go back to 400 years ago.
Yeah.
So the foundation of our country is started on, basically ownership of property, right? And at one point, folks like you and I, we were property, literal property. People owned our ancestors, and they bought our ancestors, and they traded our ancestors, and they did away with our ancestors in any way that they wanted to, because that's the foundation of America is property. Now, when we talk about at that time, it was also land. And when you look at through history, the lack of access to ownership has always been a major problem in the United States, all the way up until today. So, when we talk about Baltimore and me representing Baltimore City and being president of Baltimore City Council, Baltimore City was the first city in the United States that enacted redlining, essentially, that denied African Americans from having access to ownership of land in an appropriate and productive way. Sometimes they could, but they were getting interest rates of 14, 15, 16, 17%. They were buying houses that were already underwater. These communities were disproportionately disinvested in, from our federal to our state to our local governments. And it's really, when you look at the decay, particularly in urban America, whether it's in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, wherever it is, that any place that hasn't been completely gentrified, you're going to be able to look at that red line map, and you're going to be able to tell exactly where folks decided that Black folks should be at in those places, because they're the places, again, that had that disproportionate amount of disinvestment. So this policy is all rooted into really going after, how can we aggressively, but at the same time responsibly change our communities to provide more productive assets for the folks that have been dealing with the crime, the grime, and the blight. So that's what it's really set up for. It's a program that's not set up for developers. It's a program that's set up for the folks that have been living in these communities who should have equal access and opportunity to home ownership. We know if you're a middle class and whether lower or middle class, your biggest access for equity and growth typically is through your home, if you're able to purchase a home. We also know that in many of these communities that we're talking about, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, the same exact houses were built in other communities by the same builders, with the same material, with the same zoning, everything being the same. And when we look at those same houses in the white communities and the property values in the comparison to those same houses in the Black communities and the lack of property value, that's what we're talking about. See, we can sit here as legislators, whether it's on the local level, state, or federal level, and talk about policy till we're blue in the face, right? And policy is important. Mm-hmm. But the driving factor that's really going to go after driving systemic change in our communities is an economic paradigm shift. And you do that by giving folks access to things like property. You do that by ensuring that you're recycling the dollars in our community. And this is not the end all be all. It's not a silver bullet. However, what we're going to talk about through this legislation is definitely a step in the right direction for those individuals.
I'm glad you actually pointed that out, because before we get to the actual legislative process and the how we make this real, I did want to take a second and really talk about some of the economics and the personal economics, as it relates to the goal of having generational wealth in communities that have struggled for decades, and intentionally, where it was systematically set up for certain communities to struggle. And so if we begin to think about the possibilities of this legislation and the actual people who live in, let's just say in the community right now, but they don't own their homes.
Correct.
They either rent, or maybe they're living with a bunch of people in a certain amount of in certain homes, and they're all renting. What's the possibility as it relates to, again, the why of the possibility for I would say working class, lower middle class folks to get access to real assets, to homes that they own, and they can look at their net worth statement and say, I own a home that's worth X amount of dollars. What are your thoughts about that as it relates to the goal and the why around this legislation?
I mean, that's really the core of it. In a place like Baltimore, where you can get some pretty reasonable price points as it relates to purchasing property. particularly when we talk about the East Coast. From DC all the way up to Boston, your biggest bang for your buck as relates to an old American city that has access to 4 international airports within 100 miles, that waters to our east, mountains to our west, that has the history of a Baltimore city, the culture of a Baltimore city, the housing infrastructure of a Baltimore city, the best hospital in America, the higher learning institutions. All of those things. When you look at all those different variables, and you look at the price point of where Baltimore is. Baltimore has every single thing to be that amazing American city that we all think it to become, and to live down all the perceptions that is driven out through the national media and through Hollywood and through the studio. So, when we talk about those things, that's what gets me excited, because one, when I go and I talk to residents that are paying, $1,200, $1,300, $1,400, $1,500 in rent, knowing that their mortgage could be $700 or $800 or $900, that on a monthly basis, they're able to save that money, but then also develop ways of securing generational wealth and leveraging their properties to do other things like start small businesses or provide opportunities for their young folks or give back to other family members. This is what the rest of America has been leveraging forever, right? Mm-hmm. But there's many folks that have been barred out of it. I really think when we talked earlier and you said why, and I talked about let's jump back 400 years. Well, imagine if no one in your lineage, and this is not true for you, Byron. I know that you've done well and you've purchased properties and other like, but imagine if no one in your lineage has ever owned property in America. That's baffling, but that's our reality.
Yeah.
That is a 110,000. That is a fact that there are Black people in America that cannot point back to anyone in their past lineage other than maybe a slave owner who's owned property in their family. That's a reality, right? And then when we talk about the foundation of America, when we talk about what drives America, when we talk about our economy, and knowing the importance of the ownership of property, that's exactly what we're talking about with this legislation right here. So what we wanted to do was, again, expose folks that, some people felt like they could never own property and that, they were going to be renting just like their mother or their grandmother. No. This is important to create that connection. Another thing is, when we talk about all the attention that Baltimore's getting, Baltimore in the last quarter, I think, was the 21st largest market in real estate transactions. They're like $483 million, I believe the number. Don't quote me exactly on that number, but it was around about that number. And then when we talk about the price point again, Baltimore being on the lower end, that's a tremendous amount of volume, right? So knowing that the city's growing, knowing that the economy is going to grow, particularly as it relates to real estate, this is allowing us to also grow responsibly by providing real opportunity for folks that, again, been dealing with the blight, the crime, and the grime of these communities, holding them literally on their shoulders to ensure that they don't get displaced. Because we know once displacement sets in, we've seen it over and over again. And I'm not going to call out other major American cities.
Yeah.
But we see when that displacement happens to the degree it happens and as quickly as it happens, you lose all the culture, you lose all the history, you lose all that. And that has been kind of normalized to us in America. When it's time for folks to come and push us out, be it a highway or some revitalization plan, everything that was there and that has been the roots of that community for a very long time is literally ripped out of the shred and thrown away. And, we pop up with this classic new name of a neighborhood. And then, it's gentrified all over again. And no one who has been there is able to take advantage of the growth. So we're talking about responsible growth, responsibly growing our communities with the folks that have been living in our communities.
Well, I actually will name an actual city that I was just reading just a week or so ago in the Great Washingtonian. And there's a whole article that talked about Washington's new neighborhood, Baltimore. And they highlighted a guy who actually owned a home next to National Stadium. And in that same article, it highlighted the cost if you owned a home next to National Stadium versus if you owned a home next to Camden Yards. And the guy was like, why am I living here? I'm moving to Camden Yards. I can still get to work. I can, and I don't even have to get, everything is online now.
And see, the bigger thing when I keep talking about price point is you know, when you compare when they do those comparisons, they're not comparing apples to apples. So we talk about square footage, we talk about amenities, we can talk about lot sizes. Typically, well, not typically, always, you're going to be able to find at a much cheaper, much reasonable, advantageous price point in a place like Baltimore City in comparison to Washington, D.C., that literally flipped and was gentrified overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Another really interesting thing about Baltimore, when we talk about it, and which is great because many people say, okay, well, you're going to put these folks in these homes. And I love the boogeyman comes up with all these different things that we have to keep knocking down. But the boogeyman talks about, you develop a pipeline to home ownership. Folks are able to now own a home. But now as the communities get lifted, they're no longer able to afford the taxes and they're still going to be displaced. Because that did happen in a lot of communities in Washington as well as in New York City. The difference here in Baltimore, we have something called the Homestead Tax Credit, where we do triennial assessments of someone's property. The state of Maryland does. But with the Baltimore City Homestead Tax Credit, if it's an owner-occupied property, your tax assessment might go up 100%, but your tax liability associated with that assessment can only go up 4%. That's every 3 years.
A cap.
It's a cap, a huge cap. A cap of relatively 96%, right? Whereas in other places, your taxes went up by 100%. Boom, your liability went up by 100%. You couldn't afford it. You had to sell and you had to move out, right? That won't happen here in Baltimore. So when we talk about growing our communities responsibly, and we know we're nowhere near those price points now, why not develop opportunities for the folks that have been, again, dealing with the issues of the city to be the responsible growers of these communities that they love and that they should be able to rest in.
Actually, I'm glad you made that point because I jumped in on a conversation you were having a couple of weeks ago that outlined some of the city services. And I think someone was saying, oh, well, I guess I'm going to lose this because if this passes, right? So I'm actually currently getting XYZ housing voucher. But if I do this, I'm pretty sure I'm going to lose this. And so I want to make sure that folks really understand that if you're currently receiving something from the city as it relates to some type of housing or repairs or whatever the case may be, and then if this program, they're able to take advantage of this, that what's to be expected.
So we're going to talk about the bill later, I think, right? Get into specifics.
Yeah.
But to your point, the way that this bill is structured does not supplant any existing money. This is to supplement and develop a new program that's directly tied to American Rescue Plan dollars. So Baltimore City, like almost every other major American city and other places in between, is getting a significant amount of money as it relates to the fallout from COVID. And we knew one of the biggest things associated with COVID and why COVID took off in many of our communities was because of housing and poor housing conditions, right? So housing is a huge piece to this money called American Rescue. There was a pact that the HUD did, the Housing and Urban Development did, where they went around to certain cities in Baltimore. We were lucky to get in and be part of it. It's called House America, where we go after housing insecurity, where we talk about the importance of creating pathways of home ownership, where we talk about homelessness. So this directly fits into this model. Baltimore City is set to receive $641 million, Byron. And what I've constantly talked about with the administration and everywhere else is it's important for us not to just spend this money, but to invest this money.
Yeah.
Like develop ways where it's return on investment. And look, not only for the city of Baltimore, where we're turning non-performing assets into performing assets, but more importantly, a return on investment for the folks that are being able to participate in it. And they're our legacy residents. So we're going to get into legislation, but it's really geared towards folks who are like first-time home buyers, again, who have been living in the communities, have been renting for 10, 15, 20 years, right? It's for city workers as well, the folks that are keeping our streets moving. And there's a cap on how much you make. So 60% AMI and 40% AMI is the priorities in these programs. And then lastly, there's the folks who are receiving housing choice vouchers. So people are saying you're going to take a housing voucher that is subsidizing someone's rent to pay their mortgage. And I say you could say it that way, but I like to say it this way. we're taking the money that we're subsidizing someone's mortgage to quote unquote provide affordable rent for somebody to provide a mortgage for that individual, because the numbers don't change. Whether I pay for Miss Helen and we're subsidizing her rent every month, it's going directly to the landlord who's ultimately paying the mortgage, which is cheaper than her rent. I may have the ability of paying that house off or putting her in a much better position by putting that money directly into her hand and ensuring that it's paying off a mortgage in her name. So the X's and the O's as it relates to the money that's being put into the environment to help secure housing for an individual doesn't change. What changes is you could forever change the generational wealth of Miss Helen, as opposed to, her sitting there for 15, 20, 25 years and basically passing the same reliance and issues that were there for her, but not getting that step forward from an economic perspective to generations after her, as opposed to creating generational wealth where she become a homeowner, where she can leverage that home to do all the things that most Americans are able to do.
That's exactly right. And this question may kind of lead into the legislative process, which is fine. But my thought was, when you think about the history of, actually, I pulled out this book from my list shelf.
Not in my neighborhood. Oh yeah, Baltimore. Okay, yeah.
And the Baltimore political history, but not in my neighborhood is another example.
Then also Black Butterfly. Those three books.
Okay. So not in my neighborhood, definitely the political history by Matthew Crimson and Black Butterfly. But when you think about the history of redlining, and I was starting to think a little bit more about, so, okay, great. So someone who's currently renting, they make less than, let's just say, $70,000 a year, and they participate in this program. But the house is in a particular neighborhood that, I can't, can I just go to Bank of America and get a loan, or are they completely saying, I want to think a little bit more about, so, okay, great. So someone who's, or is it a situation, or, are there actual programs, organizations that, that the city is working with, who already participating and are willing and ready to work with folks who may live in traditionally redline neighborhoods, things like that. What are your thoughts about that as and this would be a nice way to kind of smooth into the legislative process as well?
No, that's a question that constantly comes up, and it should come up because people are like, okay, you sell someone a distressed property for $1. What does that do for them? I mean, one, that property automatically has value, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
There are organizations and programs that are set up to support kind of developments like this. If folks can remember out there used to be an FHA program called the 203K loan, which in essence was a construction loan where you can buy distressed property, and inside your mortgage, it puts the construction costs of renovating that particular home. So way that it will work here is you can easily see a $1,400, $1,500, $1,600 square foot house here in East or West Baltimore, the community that we're talking about. Now, when we look up through the national construction organizations, they put a $100 per square foot amount for a conservative, like builder grade type of build out to do new construction. Now, most of these properties aren't going to be complete new construction because many are going to have at least the exterior walls. They're going to be shells. But anyway, fast forward, if you say 1,500 square foot property at $100, that puts you at $150,000 build out, right? Now, with this program, we give you $10,000 towards closing costs and any additional fees, but then also more importantly, a $25,000 gap differential to go towards construction and repairs. So basically that $150,000 principal that we're talking about is now dropped down to $125,000 to ensure that, one, the house appraises for that amount so you can go after it and get it back, but also, two, ensuring that you're getting access to equity a lot faster because of this program in communities that have been, again, disproportionately disinvested in. So there's programs out there that would be very supportive of this. One organization that we spoke with very early on when we're going down this path was an organization by the name of NACA. That's right. NACA. And they are organization that works from coast to coast.
Mm-hmm.
They qualify millions upon millions, and saying hundreds of millions of dollars of folks. The foreclosure rate is below any bank's average because they do so much time and care on the front end. And again, these are folks that are non-traditional pipelines to home ownership. So what we did was build into the legislation was ensuring that folks had HUD certified first-time home buyers classes and training, ensuring that it had to be quality financing, meaning 15 or 30-year fixed prime or below at closing, ensuring that there's warranties built into this. But then also, I think the bigger piece that folks don't really get, it's like, okay, you take Miss Helen, who has been a renter. She calls her landlord to come fix anything from driving in a nail somewhere. How is she going to be able to manage such an extensive process of redevelopment for this distressed property? And the quick argument is, and the easy argument is, there's one institution that will always protect its interests, and that's the bank. So the reality is when Miss Helen goes to the bank, Miss Helen has to, one, pick out a certified, bonded, and insured inspector. It's going to go with Miss Helen. That's going to look through the property. That's going to determine what are the minimum requirements we need to get this property up to code and in safe and livable condition for Miss Helen to live in. They're going to do that evaluation, and the bank is going to look over that. They're going to accept it. They're going to deny it. Then they're going to come back to Miss Helen and say, now you have to find a certified, licensed, insured, bonded contractor that's independent of that inspector. And that contractor is going to go over that inspection report, and that contractor is going to determine what they can do and how much it's going to cost. So when they come out with their itemized costs and the bank accepts that, then the bank and the contractor are going to work out something called a draw schedule. And then that draw schedule, it's going to say, first, I'm going to do the roof, and it's going to cost $20,000 or $15,000 or $10,000, right? And then once they finish the roof, you know what happens? The bank just doesn't just give them the money. That inspector, that independent inspector that came out first, they go and inspect the work. Now, typically when folks think about inspector, they think about the municipal local inspector. No, this is an independent private inspector. So like if you ever purchase a home, this is the inspector that you pay $400 or $500 to go and inspect that house before you purchase the house.
Right.
So the same level of inspector. So then they go back to the bank and say, hey, the roof was done in accordance to code. You can release that money, and so on and so forth until the house is completed and finished. Again, the house also will come with a warranty of all major mechanical, and that's all embedded in there. And we really took some of the national standards and some of the models, but we're working with financial institutions that do this on a daily basis. It was easy and quickly we were able to determine this was the right path forward, particularly as it relates to linking folks who have been legacy renters, basically residents in our city, to becoming and developing pipelines to home ownership.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with NACA, so I'm glad you mentioned them, as they have really dedicated themselves to really kind of being the anti-redlining type lender from a nonprofit perspective. But at the same time, it's amazing how we've seen, and as a financial advisor and working with a lot of financial institutions, it's amazing how the death of George Floyd is quote unquote woke so many in corporate America up to say, hey, where are we on some of these issues? And particularly when we look at the banks, and they've had this history. I mean, back in college, when there was the rollout of the CRA Act and things like that. But what does that really mean as it relates to?
Well, let's go all the way back to 1866, Freedman Bank.
That's
The first branch of Freedman's Bank was right here in the city of Baltimore. People don't know that, right?
Yeah. So
look,
now is the time. Now
is the time.
And I think this has, and if so now as we look at the legislative piece of this, this has all of the makings of becoming not only just a bill that could really become monumental here in the city of Baltimore, but something that would be adopted across the country. Municipalities across the country will start to take a closer look at how they can be a bit more intentional in their bills and their legislative process. And so what is it going to take to actually take this bill and make it law? What are the next steps in this process?
So, I mean, the legislative process is a very arduous process, but then also this is the bill's not complicated, but in context, it has a lot of consequential aspects and pieces to it. Again, the city's getting $641 million. We're calling on the administration to set aside a third of that, or a little less than a third, but $200 million for this particular program. Because again, let's not spend this money, let's invest this money. But while we're investing in our citizens that have been living in the kids that have been wrong due to like formal policies, from policies shaped in bigotry to policies shaped through the privatization of whiteness and practices and procedures, to the conditions that we see now in these communities, these red line communities in the books that you kind of mentioned earlier. Why not utilize this time with this opportunity and access to this money, this American Rescue Plan money, to ensure that we're able to provide an opportunity that without that large trough of money, we'll be talking about dollar houses, but what else will we be talking about? Because the bigger piece of the dollar house program, Byron, is, again, we talked about earlier those communities, and I talked about in one community that's a historically white community where property value has gone through the roof versus the same exact house by the same builder with the same material in the Black community where the property value has basically been flatlined over the past 20, 30, 40 years. Those folks don't have equity in their property to leverage it in a way to put a new roof on or to take out lead paint infested windows or to beautify their house in a way that's going to keep the value up. So also in this package deal is not just the dollar home and the $25,000 for the person that purchases the new home, but it's also for the existing residents, the homeowners, owner-occupied units in those same communities to have access to $25,000 to do the same exact things. Put in new windows, put in a new roof, fix their porches. Because what we don't want is, one, the individuals who are now able to buy property, but their property is sitting there between two vacant. So their property is sitting there between two dilapidated structures that is pulling on their property value. We want to uplift the community at one full swoop, and we want to do it with folks who are dedicated and committed to the community that are owner occupied in the community. So again, this is going to be the boogeyman live part 2. That this is for developers and this is for speculators. This program is absolutely not. This is all shaped on folks who are from these communities and who are living in these communities.
So I've actually had folks reach out to me about that in particular.
Man, people say, "Hey, I got $20. I want 20 properties."
It's like
it doesn't work like that.
And I know exactly which block I want, right? But when you think, but what about, like, for instance, I just saw in the chat, like, if someone, let's just say that a city worker, and they have a couple people in the house, but can that person purchase more than one house?
No, there's only one person can purchase a house. Now, I mean, this is an example, and this is a real example where we have family members that, a mother and a father, they have children that live with them, or their sister lives with them.
Grown children.
Grown children.
Of
course they can purchase a house, and they should purchase a house because it's just as much as their community as anybody else's community, right? So 100%. But only one person can purchase a house. You can't purchase multiple houses. Again, this is not set up in a way that is for developers or for speculators, and that's done because 2 reasons. That's done one reason because from a speculator perspective, the house has to be fixed up in a certain time period. So it's not something where you can get a dollar house, you get accepted in a program, and you just sit on it for 5 years or 6 years and you speculate. That happens a lot here in the city of Baltimore. And the other side, from a developer's perspective, it has to be a home owner occupied. And so we track that through that Homestead Tax Credit, that amazing Homestead Tax Credit that's here in Maryland, right? You can only have one that's tied to one particular individual. So that's how you'll know that they actually live in that particular house.
Got it. So you mentioned one thing that really got me thinking. So for instance, you think about the vast amount of abandoned properties in the city, and then someone I mean, I think it's probably worth you talking a little bit about your first home purchase and equating that to this particular situation. If something like this was around, but I guess you may not have qualified. But the bigger piece of this is there are people who could very well purchase a vacant property where there's in that there's no other properties in that block. So is it adding value? The goal, or do they have to do the work similar to what you did and try to attract as many people as possible to come to the community and that kind of thing? So
well, that's the reality of where we are right now. So we know, I talked about that third quarter real estate number in Baltimore. People know about Baltimore if you're in a real estate game.
Yeah,
there was a reason that the president who's no longer there in the White House consistently put Baltimore's name in his mouth in a very negative tone, specifically as it relates to like real estate and housing conditions and other like. When you also talk about things like programs like opportunity zones, which is really just has the ability to kind of, put gentrification on steroids, particularly in areas like Baltimore City where the price point is really low, but the potential return on investment is extremely high. That's why I think right now it's like so critical that we're having these discussions, because whether you're like me, you like myself or my wife, when we purchased in West Baltimore, at the time when we had qualified this program, no, I was an electrical engineer. She was about to become a lawyer. We would not have qualified for the program that we're talking about here. However, there was still a tremendous amount of opportunity that was true back then. It's still true today. So my wife and I, we purchased a house that was valued by the city about $22,000. It was a 3,400 square foot house, brownstone, what many people would kind of call it, marble steps, limestone pillars, Widow's Peak, huge basement, all of these ginormous things. But when you first open the door and you walk 2 steps in, you could look up and see the sky and look down and see the basement floor. It had a tree growing in it. It was a complete gut, right? And, my wife talks about it all the time. It was like one of the best decisions that we ever made. I mean, being so young and people saying, why do you want to live here? Across from all these vacants, drug infestation on the corner, the blight all around you in the back. So we decided to do it anyway, and it's probably the best decision that we made. But I was able to do that FHA 203K loan that I talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I was a first-time home buyer at the time. So that construction process, I'm really intimate with. I think having a degree in electrical engineering and working as an engineer for quite some time kind of also affords me the ability and opportunity to kind of understand it on a different level. But that's what we're talking about here. So we're talking about bringing that to folks who are legacy residents, who are mostly renters and thought that they would never have an opportunity to buy. But that's not the only properties in these communities. There's still a tremendous amount of opportunities for folks who are looking to come from out of state to purchase, to relocate to Baltimore. We're going to look up in 5, 10, 15 years. Baltimore is going to be a completely different city. I'm just trying to ensure that with that growth, that we're growing it responsibly, and that what we've seen failures in other areas and the quick gentrification and easy displacement of the folks that have lived there the longest, that we're able to at least take a step forward and do it in a very responsible way to ensure that everyone has access to at the table, particularly the folks that have been dealing with the conditions of these communities for far too long.
So you did actually highlight something that kind of goes into kind of the future of what we hope to see in the city of Baltimore. But some questions that I had is, one, if someone currently lives in the city of Baltimore, but they want to purchase a property because we're talking about city-owned stock.
This is only city-owned property, correct?
Got it. So city-owned property.
We can't make private folks sell their property for $1.
Yeah, it's like, because it's not like the city is saying, "Hey, we're going to buy up some property from some private folks," and
But as the city, I can force the city to sell the properties for $1.
Got it. So somebody currently lives in the city of Baltimore. They own a property in the city of Baltimore, mm-hmm. and they want to purchase a city-owned lot. Now, granted, they already own a house.
Yep.
Can they do that?
Totally, they can do. Well, they can do that today. In the future,
under this program.
No. Under this program is directly targeted
first time
legacy renters, first time home buyers.
Okay.
that meet a certain AMI score, because the reality is, for that same person, there's 30,000 other properties that are vacant that they can go on the private market and try to purchase. Right? Baltimore's home to, the number changes, but anywhere between 30 to 40,000 vacant properties. Now, on the Baltimore City's register, it's about 14,000 that we account for, and we own about 4,000 of those. So this program is talking about like 4,000 out of the 30,000 of vacant properties and opportunities that are here right now in the city of Baltimore.
Got it. So what we're really talking about, the legislation is really trying to attract, one, the city residents who are renting, and they've never owned a home.
Never owned a home. There's a statistic out there that says more than 50% of Baltimoreans pay more than 35% a month in rent out of their paychecks.
Yeah.
35% every single month. And again,
that's real.
Community by community, whether you're paying $1,200, $1,300, $1,400, the likelihood that you could utilize this program and fix up a house, a brand new house with a warranty that's going to grow equity, as well as save $500-$600 potentially a month, is highly likely in this environment. And that's the point of what we're doing here.
Got it. So now what if somebody from, say, Columbia or any of these other places who've never rented?
Never owned.
They've never owned, and they come to the same situation for them. Anybody who's never owned, first-time home buyer.
Nope. Well, I'm sorry for you as well. This is for legacy. This is for legacy residents.
Got it.
This is for folks that have been living in these conditions for the past 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, when the city has disproportionately disinvested in their communities. They're the ones that have been hearing the gunshots, that have been sending their children to inadequate schools, have had collapsed alleys for years, are dealing with, again, the grime, the blight, the crime of the city of Baltimore. These are the folks that are moving out the fastest, but these are also the folks that should be gaining the most out of Baltimore City's growth. So that's the purpose of this program. I'm glad you asked that question.
So I can't do on my next recruitment program. You can say, hey, come to Baltimore because we got this new dollar home program.
This guy's selling houses for $1. No. It's for folks who have been living in those communities that have been dealing with, again, the disproportionate amount of disinvestment.
What are some of the other kind of stipulations around, like, hey, you need to be in the house for X amount of years, or things like that is important for folks to know that could be seen as kind of a loophole, but things that definitely should be addressed?
No, definitely. That's a good question. So you have to fix a property up within 18 months, but there's ways around that. Like if you're moving the ball down the field and you are fixing it up, maybe you have a run over 6 months or 8 months or a year, you're still able to retain the property, but you have to fix it up in a certain time period. Okay. And then more importantly, you have to live in that property for a certain time period.
Got it.
That's the homestead aspect of it. So it has to be owner-occupied for 10 years. So you can't fix it up and then start renting it out the next week, or you can't fix it up and then sell it in 2 years and get some property and run away. That's going to come back to that $25,000 grant that the city's providing you, free and clear, as long as you decide that that's where your roots are and you're going to be living in that community.
Got it. This is good. Well, I tell you, man, I guess my bigger thought is, as we look into the future, what's the potential? And we hear about cities like Atlanta. For instance, I remember being in college and the whole Maynard Jackson, Andrew Young, and all the policies they were laying out that to this day are still creating wealth for average everyday people in those cities. And is this that type of legislation that could begin the process of definitely within the city of Baltimore residents? Or
I think what this legislation is doing is like reframing our focus as it relates to real estate. Baltimore is that type of city where if you knew the right website, or if you knew the right person that's doing this, the inside track to that, you were attending these real estate meetings. Yeah, your friend had Baltimore is that type of city where that's how real estate has always moved, and it's never on a holistic level benefited Black or brown communities or folks that were interested in real estate. What this does is this is a step in the right direction of leveling the playing field. I'm saying there's folks in our city that should benefit from the known growth that we're going to see over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Mm-hmm. Why not take this opportunity to leverage in a way to forever change the generational wealth and the ability for them to leverage these properties to continue to do great things for their families, as opposed to what we've seen in other places. And not to say that they knew this was going to happen, or they should have jumped in front of it, or they should have had this program. I'm not trying to stay or compare, but you can go to places like, particularly places like in Washington, D.C., or say in Brooklyn or Harlem, where literally overnight, it went from Black and brown communities with strong heritage, strong roots, and strong culture, to folks that transplanted in, set up shop, and all that history, all that culture was lost. But more importantly, those people were gone forever. They were displaced. We do not want that to happen. I do not think that that's a responsible way of growing our cities. And I think that this is not a silver bullet. This is not the end all be all, but this is certainly a step in the right direction to ensure that we provide real opportunities for our folks.
And I guess it's probably also to be clear that this piece of legislation is specific to Baltimore City residents who have never owned, the first-time home buyers. But this isn't the only kind of all-encompassing housing or economic effort for the city that could be beneficial to someone who would love to move to Baltimore, or even in the case of the developers who want to, especially some of the small Black developers who want to participate in some of these things. Like, there are other pieces of legislation that could be.
Listen, the reality is, if a city tells you that they're going to not only turn non-performing assets into performing assets, meaning take a dilapidated structure and make it a livable condition, right? The city's working directly and aggressively and targeting on those areas. They're going to do that. Two, they're going to take the distressed properties that are occupied in those areas and help those residents fix them up. The amount of money that's going to go into these communities, typically developer money follows the money. And so the idea is you can do this in a very responsible way without displacing folks. So now to the other $20,000 vacant properties that are out there, that's sitting out there, folks should, yes, be coming in and purchasing and buying and fixing up and living. Again, when we talk about the cost of living here in the city of Baltimore, you talk about the potential return of investment that you're going to get owning a home in a place like Baltimore in comparison to our neighboring city of like Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia. The price point and the value is here, particularly in this virtual environment. I've known folks that have literally taken their careers and were working in Brooklyn or working in Manhattan and have moved to Baltimore and purchased a home. Yeah. So they owned an apartment there, and they see that they can come down in Baltimore and buy a house for, these aren't the houses that we're talking about in this program, but they could buy a house for $300,000, $350,000, or $400,000. That would be, $1.2 million brownstones in New York. And they're coming down and buying them left and right.
Yeah.
And living in them.
Well, actually, and that does bring up a question. Like, so is there a certain, because the city owns properties all over the city.
So the properties that we're talking about, the 4,000 we're talking about, are residential properties. So it's not like old, we're not selling schools for $1 or like.
Yeah, but some properties
But these are all residential properties. But, remember when I said earlier about the 40% and 60% AMI, the priorities will be flipped. So 40% or below AMI gets the first, they get the first dibs, if I could tell you, on the properties, if I could say it that way. Because the likelihood that they're going to be able to fix up, say, a 3,000 square foot house is somewhat highly unlikely. Whereas, so that's why we set it up that way, to create that prioritization, to ensure that they had the biggest access of picking and choosing where they would like to live and what properties they would like to live in. So they are prioritized on that list to pick from the registry that we're creating.
No, that makes a lot of sense. At the end of the day, if somebody earns $65,000 a year or $50,000 a year and they're renting, the loan capacity for them is different from somebody who would, if you're above that actual income amount, then that limits the type of home you can purchase. So that's
a good way to put it. So we set the prioritization based off of loan capacity.
Got it. All right, we're right up on 7:00, man. So I want to make sure that people know what's next, what they can do to be a part, especially those who want to support this legislation. any dates, any links that folks can go to learn more?
First, they can follow us on all social media platforms. And my kids were surprised today that we're even on Snapchat and TikTok, but they can follow us on every social media platform at Balt Council. That's at BALT Council, COUNCIL. So BALT Council, Balt Council, right? Every social media platform. If you want to look at like frequently asked questions, you can go to our website, which is baltimorecitycouncil.com. Click on the tab Dollar House that has a plethora of information as well as the frequently asked questions that we've been receiving. And then for folks who are local, there's going to be a hearing that's going to happen next week, December the 20th at 5 o'clock, which is going to be a hearing to go over the legislation. It's not going to be a time for us to vote anything out, put any amendments on it, but it's going to really be an opportunity, more of an information session. So the agencies are there and they're aware of all the issues and concerns they can raise at that point. So council members can do the same thing, but more importantly, so the general public can be there to testify and also raise their concerns or their support of this piece of legislation. And we look to have it's all going to be all virtual. So everybody can tune in. You can go to the same Baltimore City Council website, get the WebEx link. You can sit there and watch it. You can call on your phone and listen in. And then we're going to have a really, really robust legislative process on this bill come first quarter next year. And it's my hope that the boogeyman is going to put all his rumors out there about this is for developers and this and these people can't do this and these people can't do that. But it'll be a way for us to get ahead of all of that, for us to work down the pathway to hopefully get this in action, get this into law, get this signed, and then move forward with the program.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. I think that, as we finish up here, I still go back to when I moved here originally, and folks were like, "You don't want to move to Baltimore, and have you heard about this, and have you heard about that?" And it didn't take long to realize that, for me, that if you got the right people in office, that they'll begin to create legislation and laws and programs that, we may not know and understand ourselves, but could be definitely beneficial to the long-term aspect for our families and kids and grandkids and the whole nine. And that's really what we want to see for the city. I think everybody, even those who are, would love to poke holes at the legislation, everybody cares about the city. They want to see the city go into the next level. And so I think this is a great step in the right direction, especially from an economic perspective and for folks who usually don't have access to assets, which is a major part, especially as we look at Black wealth and the Black wealth agenda. This is definitely a move in the right direction and pointing directly at the socioeconomics in the city that we all know and love. So we appreciate it, man. This is great time having this conversation. Thank you for taking time to outline and unpack this with us a little bit in more detail. Anytime you want to.
Hey, man, anytime you want me on, let's do it. Whether we're talking about this or talking about other things that, is going to create better outcomes for our communities, I'm always willing to participate. I think a show like this is so good because, one, there's so much mutual interest of folks that are going to tune into you and listen to this. That's not just going to be here in Baltimore, but get to see Baltimore City exposed in a different way. If you sit back on your couch and you watch documentaries or you listen to mainstream media news, you're not going to see what you see unless you put your boots on the ground in a place like Baltimore. And I think that was your story too, Byron, that you kind of laid out. I'm excited because Baltimore's host to the CIAA basketball conference this year. In past, they brought 100,000 folks to Charlotte, $50 million economic development engine on that week for Charlotte. So I'm excited to see that here in Baltimore. But more importantly, I'm excited to expose folks like you and I from around the country to what Baltimore City is really about. And it's an exciting time, not only in our city, coming off the verge of the pandemic, but it's an exciting time for particularly Black folks and Black folks that are interested in becoming entrepreneurs and purchasing a property. And that's what this legislation speaks to the heart of.
Yeah, well, we would love to have you back, man. This is, as a Florida boy by heart, but Baltimore is the place I'll spend the rest of my life. I'm unapologetically in love with Black economics and seeing the progress of Black people. And we have to understand the value of public policy and the role public policy plays in that. And, so as you guys continue to think about things that could be beneficial, we want to be able to create platforms and mediums for you to share, reach people who even may be outside of the network and outside of the city, but so we can have these in-depth conversations and begin to educate ourselves and really use that information and put it into practice. So thank you again. I know I'm in between food and family, so I'll let you get to it, but I truly appreciate your time this evening to talk about the Dollar House program and the legislation and the next steps. And we look forward to seeing the progress of this legislation here in the next few weeks.
All right, brother. Good talking to you.
All right, brother. Thank you.
See you.